Hi guys! So we're going to finish up the Cold War today with some of the hot spots of the Cold War. And our first hotspot is the Korean War. So this video for this lesson is going to be divided into two parts. This first part is just on the Korean War. The second part will be on the Vietnam War. So let's flip this around. Hotspots of the Cold War. Although there were no actual wars between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, there were proxy wars between their allies, between their money, between their equipment, and between their ideologies. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Korean War. Now your parents, and maybe even you, have probably a little bit of knowledge of the Korean War because one of the greatest TV shows of the late 70s and the very early 80s was MASH. And you can watch reruns of MASH. It's streaming all over the place. And maybe your mom or dad loved MASH like I did. And MASH was set during the Korean War. It was really supposed to be a commentary on the Vietnam War, but the setting was the Korean War. So the causes of the Korean War. To understand the roots of the Korean War, we have to go back to the end of World War II. From 1910, after the Sino-Japanese War, to the end of World War II, the Korean Peninsula belonged to the Japanese Empire. But even during World War II, the Allies were debating, while the war was going on, what should happen to Korea in anticipation of their victory. In November 1943, there was a meeting. There's one of these wartime conferences, like the Potsdam Conference and the Yalta Conference. This one was called the Cairo Conference, where the U.S. President, FDR, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and the leader of the Chinese nationalists named Chiang Kai-shek met to discuss what would happen to the remains of the Japanese Empire. They decided at that time that the peninsula should become a free and independent country. When the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, a provisional or a temporary government was set up in Korea. The Soviet Union exercised control over the northern half, and the U.S. took control of the southern half. During World War II, the Soviet Union and the U.S. were allies. This is very important to know. Even though after the World War II, we were kind of like, we hate each other. During the war, they were pals. So as pals, just like they did with Germany, they divided Korea into two parts. The boundary between the two parts, here's the USSR's part, here's the US's part. The boundary was made up of the 38th parallel, like a line of latitude. This became known as the DMZ, and even today, in 2020, it's still the DMZ. The plan was for the two halves to unite eventually, but the US and the Soviet Union couldn't agree on what type of government the new Korean nation should have. The Soviet Union, shockingly, wanted to be communist. The U.S. wanted it to be democratic-ish, pro-American for sure. The leader of the southern part of Korea was not democratic. He was not a good guy. He was a dictator. But he liked the U.S., so we liked him. Unable to reach a resolution, the Republic of Korea was declared in the southern half, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was declared in the Soviet half. The occasional border skirmishes throughout the 1940s erupted into an all-out war when nearly 100,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, and attacked South Korea in June of 1950. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, you've probably heard of his grandson, Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung was determined to rule a united Korea. Negotiations for this unification went nowhere, so Sung, his name was actually Kim decided to use force to achieve his aims. Armed with tanks and heavy artillery, North Korean forces advanced quickly. On June 28th, the capital city of Seoul fell. On June 27, 1950, the UN convened and passed what's called Resolution 83. Now, look, this is only the 83rd thing they've done. The UN was brand new. So this is, whoopsie, this was a pretty new organization. Resolution 83 authorized member states to provide military assistance to South Korea. That exact same day, President Harry Truman authorized the use of U.S. forces to help liberate South Korea. The Korean War was not fought unilaterally between American and North Korean forces. However, Rather, it was fought between UN forces, which the US was kind of the bossy applesaucy of, and North Korea's People's Army, or the KPA. That said, UN forces were predominantly composed of Americans. There are lots of battles in the Korean War. Maybe even your grandpa fought in the Korean War, or your great-grandfather, probably more likely, fought in the Korean War. The two most important were called the Battle of Pusan and the Battle of Incheon. This is the one, Incheon province. If your parents did watch MASH, this is where the MASH hospital was set up, in Incheon, right inside the battle zones. One of the most important battles of the Korean War was the Battle of Pusan, or the Pusan Perimeter, in which United Nations forces held out for 6 weeks on the southeastern tip of the peninsula. It's way down here. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel. North Korean forces pushed the UN way down to here. And for 6 weeks, they held on like by their toenails. We don't want to get pushed out of the peninsula. And eventually they fought back, and pushed the North Korean forces all the way back to the Yalu River, right up here in the north, right on the border of China. The UN forces had been successful in fending off the KPA, or the Korean People's Army, advances. After holding out for 6 weeks, UN forces went on the offensive and counterattacked in the Battle of Incheon. Incheon is up here. It was an amphibious assault on the port of Incheon, which was about 100 miles from Seoul. The battle was a decisive victory for UN forces. It resulted in the liberation of Seoul and pushed the KPA back up the peninsula. I'm sorry, my kids are being very loud right now, but this is what we're doing. This daring offensive was led by none other than our old pal Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, of course, rose to fame as the commander of American forces in the Pacific during World War II. In addition to this, he was essentially the viceroy, or kind of the king, the American appointed king of Japan. Now he was directing UN operations during the Korean War. Well, for the time being. Following the Battle of Incheon, Chinese forces intervened to assist the struggling KPA, or Korean People's Army. With the help of the Chinese, UN forces suffered a series of defeats. Increasingly, MacArthur called for an aggressive approach to waging war. He even suggested they use nuclear bombs. He called for advances into North Korea, and even into China, much to the frustration of Harry Truman, who favored a more cautious approach. President Truman fired MacArthur, sent him home for being insubordinate, and MacArthur returned home, and everybody in America was like, yay, Governor or General MacArthur, you're awesome. And Truman, you stink. The end of the Korean War. Following MacArthur's relief, or being fired, the Korean War settled into a stalemate around the 38th parallel. You guys remember the word stalemate from World War I. Both sides were unable to gain the advantage. The Korean Armistice Agreement was signed in July 27, 1953. The agreement said, hey, how about we divide Korea at the 38th parallel? It led to a ceasefire, the exchange of prisoners or POWs, and the establishment of the DMZ. Technically, the Korean War isn't over because no peace treaty has been signed. Interestingly enough, North Korea maintains that they won the war. And sometimes small little conflicts erupt along the DMZ. And I found this newspaper image from the Syracuse newspaper from 1953. Truce halts fighting today. Syracuse calm over armistice. And there's a bunch of Syracuse headlines. All right, so you're going to stop here and you're going to take a Google Forms assessment. Won't that be fun? And look at my hair's so long now I can braid it. Bye.